Genesis 6 multiple times. Matter of fact, it wasn't that long ago that I went through it just like we're doing, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And I find that I can never really tap it. There's just so much there in this section. So we're gonna be taking a look at that tonight. I have no intention of finishing Genesis 6 tonight. It'll take us at least a couple weeks, but it is the same story all the way through chapter 9. So we're going to be talking about the same story for a while. Before we do, let's stop and pray. Lord, how I thank you that you have left us this record, and I'm so excited to be able to look into these ancient words and know that this is the truth, that this is what you've done. And I'm so excited to see the picture of our own salvation and what you've done for us. How we thank you, Lord. Amen. So here we are in Genesis 6. Now remember where we have been. God created absolute perfection. He created a world that had a perfect relational connection between God and man, between man, and between man and all of other creation. Absolutely perfect situation. A real sense of oneness and communion in these relationships that were available. We don't know what the Garden of Eden looked like. We don't know what the people who lived there looked like. But we do know that there was a real, it's just the best term I can think of, a sense of oneness, a real communion, a perfect relationship. And we know that all that was required to maintain that relationship was that the people just simply took God at His word. But they didn't. The people determined that if given the choice, they'd like a shot at being their own God. And in order to do that, to have that opportunity, they had to trade in this relationship of oneness. Part of this relationship of oneness allowed them to have dominion over the rest of creation. So they were in charge of the animals and creation as it was. They gave that up. They gave up the oneness, the closeness with God, the closeness with one another, and the closeness with creation. And they gave up their role as the masters, as it were, of creation to have a chance at being their own God and seeing what they could do on their own. And it didn't work out very well. And there's a whole sermon series in that, because that's what we all do. We have an opportunity to have a oneness relationship with God. We have the opportunity to be in good communion with one another. But we like to trade that in and see what we can do on our own. See how far we can go by ourselves. And when we find out, we regret our choice. And that was certainly the case with the man and the woman. They regretted the choice that they had made. They lost this level of perfection. We also see that God was aware that this had happened and that this would happen, and that He had a plan to fix it. And His plan is introduced to us in verse 15 of Genesis 3, where He says, "The seed of the woman will come, crush the head of the serpent, but his heel will be bruised." We talked extensively about all that means, but it's really the first mention of the gospel and of the salvific work of Christ. It's our first evangelon. It's our first mention of evangelism, that God's going to come and fix it. And we see that by the time we get to Genesis chapter 4, and the woman has her first son, that she's excited that it's all going to be fixed just then. And that's the way we are. God says, "Hey, I'm going to take care of things." And we say, "Okay, I'm going to give you a hand, and we're going to get it done in a hurry." But her bringing forth a man wasn't what God had in mind. And she figured that out very quickly when she brought forth the second man and said, "Hey, this ain't working. The seed of the woman is not natural-born people." Well, then, of course, we find out that the sin of the parents, the rebellion of the parents in wanting to be their own God, was inherited by the boys, who then Cain ended up killing his brother Abel. And then we see that more children are born to Adam and Eve, and they have a son named Seth. And Seth is the inheritor of the promise. Now, this is really important. You really got to understand this. This is going to impact really the rest of what we talk about in the Old Testament. You see, in the Old Testament, people had a legal firstborn, and the legal firstborn was not always the actual physical firstborn. And that's important because the legal firstborn inherits some things that the rest of the kids don't inherit. Well, Seth is the legal firstborn, as it were, the inheritor of the promise that was given to Adam. Cain could have been, he was born first, he could have been, but he chose to go his own way. He had the opportunity to have the blessing, and he said, I'd rather be my own God. That's a theme you're going to see over and over in the Old Testament. Now, the cool thing is Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 is a genealogy of the children that were born from Adam on, the legal inheritor children that were born. And as we talked a few weeks ago, when we talked about Genesis chapter 5, their names tell a story, and the story that they tell is that man has been appointed as mortal. In other words, it's been determined that man will die. And this is sad. This is sorrowful. This wasn't the intention of God. God didn't intend for us to experience that kind of separation. But, as Genesis chapter 5 tells us, man was appointed as mortal, and this is sad. But, from the blessed God, one will come down who is a teacher. And of course, one did come down from the blessed God who was a teacher, and that was Christ. His death will bring to the poor and lowly relief and comfort. It's an amazing sentence. His death will bring to the poor and lowly. Oh, we've been talking about this a couple weeks on Sunday morning. If you come to God with your cup 9/10 of the way full and say, fill my cup, Lord, He's going to say, sorry, it's already full. If you come with it 1/10 of the way full and say, would you fill my cup? He's going to say, you're going to need to dump out what's in there. You've got to come to me poor and lowly with nothing, because honestly, nothing you bring is going to work. You got to come poor and lowly. And for the poor and lowly who come hungering and thirsting after righteousness, oh, they'll be filled. To the poor and lowly, His death will bring relief and comfort. Now, those names have so much power in the story we're about to tell as well. But I've really had to pick what we're going to talk about in Genesis chapter 6. There is so much we could get into. But we're going to take our time, but we will by no means experience everything that Genesis has to offer in our study in Genesis in this time. And I tell you that because one of my goals for this church this year is that every person associated with this church is in the Word every day. I want every person to be in the Word every day. And honestly, this is so easy right now because the vast majority of us have smartphones. And on the smartphone, you can download a Bible app like Open Bible. That's one that I use with teenagers so often because it's just so easy. And every day you can get up and make sure that the first words your eyes see are the words of Scripture. And just pull it up and read a little bit. Or as you're riding in the car or sitting on the bus, not driving. Or it's break time at work or whatever. And normally you just pop that open and zip through Instagram. Instead, you can pop that open and grab a chapter or a section. And maybe, if you're really getting into it, you could say, hey, I'm reading through this, and I wonder if you have another book that might go along with it that maybe would help to direct. There's people here that have a ton of connections. And if you're online and you're saying, well, I want to be part of that, well, then join in. And if you have questions, well, email them in or submit them via YouTube. Everybody should be in the Word. There is so much more you can get out of this stuff than just what we're going to talk about over the course of our Wednesday nights. Now, we need to remember the sequence of the people as we step into Genesis chapter 6. Remember that Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912. Enosh lived 905. Kenan lived 910. Mahalalel, he lived 895. He's just a young guy. Jared lived 962. Enoch, hopefully we get to Enoch next week, but it might be the week after that. Enoch lived 365 years, and he did not die. He went for a walk with God and never came back. Oh, to be like Enoch. And then Methuselah. And you know Methuselah lived 969 years, longest lived person for which we have a record. And then came Lamech, 777 years, and then Noah. Now, when we catch up in our story, Noah is around 600 years old. Depending on how you do your accounting, he might have been exactly 600 years old. And we catch up with Noah in time for a conversation with God. And that brings me to a big, big question that we must settle. A question I honestly wanted to avoid and was planning to avoid when I first started this study. But I realized we can't go on until we settle this question. And the question is, do I really believe all this stuff? That Methuselah lived 969 years. That Enoch never died. Do I really believe that stuff? We all know where this is going. You hear Noah, here comes the flood. We all know. Do I really believe that in 40 days the entire earth was flooded and everything on the earth died except for what was in the ark? And somehow just what was in the ark was enough to rebuild all of the earth as we know it now? Do I really believe all that stuff? Actually, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. I believe absolutely every word of it to be absolute, literal truth. And I want you to know why. Now, I will admit to you that in the very beginning, I just determined to. As a kid, when I got my first King James Bible from my grandparents, I determined that I would choose to believe it, knowing I had the choice. I determined I would choose to believe it. And that's a choice that I have re-upped multiple times in my life, that I can't explain it, I don't understand it, but I'm going to choose to believe it. I was actually, I'm almost done reading through Job in my own reading, and there's been a couple of times in reading through Job that I've just had to be like, well, okay. I chose to believe it for a very simple reason. I fully intend to go to heaven. I fully intend. And I have it on good authority that I will, because the Bible says whosoever believes in him won't perish but have everlasting life. And I did a little work on what that word believes mean, and I say, hey, yeah, that's me. I believe in him. I am trusting Christ with my eternal salvation. I'm trusting Christ with today and forever. Cool. I will get to go to heaven. And that's something Tom and I have been talking about here lately. And guys, if you have any doubts about how fantastic what God has planned for us, if you have any doubts, let's just talk for a few minutes. I so want to be a part of that. And so I was thinking one day I'm going to get invited there to go to heaven. And I'm going to get up there, and I believe that Jesus is going to meet me, and I'm going to get to give him a big hug and talk to him for a while. And hopefully I'll hear him say something like, well done, my good and faithful servant. Hopefully I'll hear something like that. But I was thinking about it one time, and I thought, what I don't want to hear him say is, you made it. You believed in me, and you made it, and that's good. But I got a question for you, Troy. Why didn't you just believe what I told you? I determined I would rather have him greet me with a big hug and, well done, my good and faithful servant. I'm so glad you're here. Oh, but Troy, I got to ask, why did you believe all that stuff? Come on, like 969. Why did you believe that? And me say, well, because I thought you said it, Lord. And if I think you say it, I'm going to believe it. I would rather have that conversation than my son. You missed so much. Why didn't you just believe? And so I determined I was just going to believe it. That's fine. And I heard about evolution and all this stuff, and all this atheistic stuff. And I thought, well, that's fine for them, but I've decided I'm going to learn something else. Up until about 7th or 8th grade, when we went on a field trip with my geology class, I enjoy geology. We went on a field trip with my geology class out to a place in rural Oregon where the ground has been cut away and you can clearly see all the strata in the rock. And they said, here's what happened. Over the course of eons, of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, layers were laid down. And you can see the layers right here in the rock. And I thought, oh no. that can't possibly fit with what I've chosen to believe. And the evidence is right before my eyes. What am I going to do? So I did a little studying on the strata. I remember thinking, where'd all that dirt come from over millions of years? It just lied on top. I mean, listen, I understand my room will get a mess in a week. But I know where all that junk came from. Where'd it come from? And nobody can answer my question. And then I got to thinking, those strata they're so clean cut. They're just perfect. Well, when I look out in my yard, it's not perfect like that. The dirt is not. How did it get so clean cut and perfect? And so I started asking questions about how this comes together. And the answer that I was given rocked my world. A genuine scientist told me, you can make strata in a glass jar. And I said, really, how? And he said, take different kinds of dirt and rock, different density of dirt and rock, put it into a glass jar, but not very full, maybe just a third of the way full, fill it up about 3/4 of the way with water, and then shake it for a while, and then put it down on the table, take the lid off, and go away. Come back the next day, and you'll have strata. And he was right. That's how you make strata. And I thought to myself, that sounds a lot more like a flood than millions of years. And then came carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating works this way. Carbon-14 is an isotope that has a predictable decay rate. Carbon-14 as an isotope decays at a steady and straight rate. And everything on this planet has carbon-14 in it. And so you can dig something up and measure the decay of the carbon-14 that's in it, and it will tell you how long since it originated. And it works beautifully. We know because we've managed to dig stuff up that we can date. Archaeological things with people's names on them and situations on them that give us an idea of when they should have happened. And then we can run a carbon-14 test on it. And sure enough, if that guy lived 3,553 years ago, the carbon-14 dating tells us it was 3,553 years ago. And I had people in my science classes tell me, this bone carbon dates to 250,000 years ago. And I thought, oh no! What do I do with this now? And then I learned something. A scientist once told me that since 1946, carbon-14 hasn't quite worked the same. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, there were 2 bombs dropped in Japan. They were hydrogen atomic bombs. And they were big enough that they caused a magnetic interference in the earth. I don't understand that. But they caused some kind of interference that caused a change in the decay rate of carbon-14. So since then, when we date something carbon-14, we have to use a different scale. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I was pretty sure I'd heard that there had been a major magnetic disturbance in the world at some point, that the North and South Pole had even switched. And sure enough, that was somewhere in the 6,000 years ago range. And I said, well, what do we do about carbon-14 dating from then? And he told me this is the deal. Carbon-14 is perfectly accurate back to between 5,500 and 6,000 years ago. That the things we test pre-1945 and post 6,000 years ago, we can be right on the money. Right on the money. But anything older than that, it's just a guess. And I said, well, what about these bones that we're finding that are 150 million years old? And he said, well, let me tell you how we date those, he said. Somebody digs those up and they send them to us and they ask us to carbon-14 date them, and we run carbon-14 dating on it, and we realize that the scale that we have is not accurate. And so we just call them back and say, well, what strata did you find it in? And based on their answer, we make an assumption about the date. And I already had a problem with strata. And now I got a problem with carbon-14. So I said, let's talk about this fossil record here for a bit. And I started looking into the fossil record, and I found some very disturbing things. I found that there are fossils together that aren't supposed to be. Like in Texas, there's a place, I got the name of it in here, I can't remember it off the top of my head, and I'm probably not going to find it, but there's a place there in Texas where where Rose Creek fossil bed in Texas, where there are a bunch of footprints of creatures who were running from something. They were really scared, whatever they were running from. And in there's some creatures you might kind of recognize, some big mammals and stuff. But then there's some dinosaur footprints, big dinosaur footprints of a couple different kinds of dinosaurs. And right there with the dinosaur footprints are human feet, size 10. Well, how'd that happen? How do we get these fossils anyway? Because I happen to know that if you bury an animal in the ground and you go to dig it up 10-ish years later, there's nothing left. How'd this happen? And I was told, well, it happened when animals die very suddenly, or when there are footprints made very suddenly that don't have time to wash away, and then it all gets filled in with mud. Mud is the number one tool that we have to understand the ancient world, I was told, because it locks in the fossils. So before the animals have time to degrade, they get locked in mud and they become a fossil. Okay. Then how do we have the human footprints and the dinosaur footprints locked in the same mud if it had to be fastened at the same time? Oh, well, we don't know how that happened, says Mr. Scientist. And I said, okay, well, I got some other problems. Because in California, near the coast of Southern California, they were doing some digging for oil exploration, 50 years ago or so? And they found a fossilized great whale, enormous whale. And it died vertically, not horizontally. And the fossil just happens to go through 4 strata. Well, but I thought that they had to get encased in mud before they decayed. And then came the petrified forests. And then came oil shale. I said, this ain't working for me. But what about the Neanderthal man that was dug up in Wisconsin? What about Neanderthal man? Well, what about Neanderthal man? Well, that's what we know what humans used to be. I said, really? Well, let's take a look at Neanderthal man. You know what they found? They found a molar and a little section of jaw. And they said, this is Neanderthal man. But we have something available to us that they didn't used to have before. We have DNA testing, which shouldn't work on those kinds of things because the DNA should be gone if it was hundreds of millions of years ago. But there was still DNA in Neanderthal man, so they pulled DNA to see what he was, and guess what he was? A common pig. Oops, wasn't a man after all. What about Lucy? Same thing, monkey, big ape, actually. So I begin to not trust the historical record as it was being told to me. And I said, what could have caused strata? What could have caused formations like we see in places like Gardens of the Gods and there in Utah and Ornament Valley? What could have caused these kinds of things? What could have caused these animals to die so suddenly, so many of them? What could have caused coal shale? What could have caused all of these things? And the answer doesn't matter the scientist you ask. If they're going to look at it objectively, they'll tell you, well, it was a deluge of water, or what I would call a flood. But they're still not sure that it was the flood. It wasn't necessarily a global flood. I mean, come on, guys. That's just legend. Well, all legends have some basis in reality. So I started looking into that a little bit. And do you know what I discovered? Everybody on the earth talks about the flood. We currently have records of 270 nations or tribal groups that have a flood story. And Tom was actually telling me about one that his family group had that's been wiped out. We don't have that record now. So 271 with that one. And in those 270 stories, first of all, we find those all over the world. This is not in any one particular area. I mean, everybody from the Aborigines in Australia to the Franks and Gauls in Northern Europe to the native people of Siberia and here in Alaska, every one of them has these stories. 270 different ones we have records of. Probably the most famous other than the Bible is called the Gilgamesh epic. It's so funny. You should have your people do a play on the Gilgamesh epic. It's comics. It's so funny. Go home and look it up. I'm sure you can find it on the internet and read it. It's really funny. It's like a Steve Martin version of the flood. Anyway, there are some commonalities between these 270 stories. 88% of these stories note that a single family was favored by God or the gods and spared. 70% say that their survival was by means of a boat. 95% of them say the sole cause of all of the catastrophe we see on the earth today was this one great flood. Two-thirds, 66%, say that the flood was a direct response of the gods or God to the wickedness of man. 77% say that the animals we have now were also saved by this family on the same boat. 57% say that at the end of it all, the survivors landed their boat on a mountain, and more. Most of them, when they're talking about this family, use some sort of local form of the name we would call Noah, like the Polynesian tribes that became the people of Hawaii. To this day, they call him Nu'u'u. Sounds a little like Noah to me. The vast majority of them speak about this man, Noah, Nu'u'u, sending out birds, seeing a rainbow, and having his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives with him. Wow. If that doesn't give you chills, you're not paying attention. But we got to be a little bit more specific, because this is what I believe, and I believe it literally. How could I say that I believe that literally? Listen, I don't know anyone who was there. And as far as I know, nobody used their iPhone to take a recording of the event. So how do I know that this is the story? Well, let me tell you how I know this was the story. Did you know that Adam, the first man, was still alive and a contemporary of Methuselah, the man who lived the longest? Methuselah, of course, was Noah's granddad. Methuselah died the year of the flood. Remember, his death will bring? Ooh, chills. Methuselah died the year of the flood. And we know that Methuselah talked with Adam. We know this. We don't have to guess. Oh, I know, it's not written in here. But that's the way people worked. Right on down through the line of the Hebrew people that we're going to talk about. Remember, I mentioned the legal firstborn. It's very important. There were things that the firstborn inherited. The firstborn, the legal firstborn, inherited a double share of the estate. So if there were 3 brothers, the estate would be split 4 ways, and the legal firstborn would get 2 shares. And the reason is because it's his responsibility to take care of all the elders. So that extra share was for him to make sure that mom and dad and grandpa and grandma and great-grandma and all of them are all taken care of. And if any of his other brothers should pass away and not be able to take care of their widows and children, well, then that extra share of the estate would take care of them. So he inherited that, all right? He also inherited, and this was the most important thing, he inherited the blessing. We'll talk about that when we get to Jacob and Esau. And the blessing included the stories. You see, we don't have a written record of anything until Moses comes along. But we do have a really good record, because the way that these people would tell each other stories was fantastic. They would gather around in the evening when all the work is done and the meal is over. And the father, now granddad might still be here, and great-granddad and great-granddad and great-great-granddad, they might still be here. But the father of the active family at the time would tell a story. Let me tell you about Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And he would relay the story. Now, Adam was the first man. once he's done telling the story, the one who would be his legal inheritor would repeat the story back to him. And he had to repeat it back not just word for word, but inflection for inflection. He had to stand up and say, now Adam was the first man. Same gestures, same look on his face. If he got up and said, now, Adam, he was the first man. Wrong. Do it again. And over the course of years, decades even, he would perfect it. And if he missed the slightest point, granddad and great-granddad and great-granddad would say, no, that's not the way I heard it. And he would repeat these things back absolutely perfectly. And to this day, there are Hebrew people who do exactly that. Now, Adam knew Methuselah. Adam and Methuselah sat around the same campfire. Methuselah told the stories he heard from Adam. Adam saw it all firsthand. He heard about it from God if he didn't see it himself. And Methuselah told it back, and Adam said, wait, young man, that's not the way I told it. And he would tell it again until Methuselah could nail it, and Lamech could nail it, and Noah could nail it, and Shem could nail it, all the way down through the Levitical list until we get to Moses, who said, there are so many of us now, I better write this down. So I think we can have it on pretty darn good authority that the words we read in the book of Genesis, right up through the end of chapter 50, are exactly the words that were repeated. Now, mine's in English. I get it. We got to figure some things out. But if we can find them in classical Hebrew, which is what we like to study in, then we can be assured that these are exactly the words. When you add that all up, I'm not really sure that it makes sense to not take it literally. I mean, listen, I wasn't there, all right? I know I'm getting older, but I'm not that old. I wasn't there. I didn't see it myself. I'm going to have to trust another source. Now, I can trust what scientists tell me about the age of light. I can trust that because they've measured the speed of light and they think that they have found a constant for it. And they think that we can say, well, this star is this far away from our planet, and so we can measure how long the light takes to get there, and we can say that we're at least that old. We can do that. We can do that. We can see our farthest away star, and it took hundreds of billions of years to get here, so we're hundreds of billions years old. We can trust that if we want. The problem is they really haven't been right about the speed of light yet. They keep guessing, and we're getting it wrong, and we have to keep... people say, the Bible's not a science book. Yeah, I'm really glad it's not a science book, because have you ever seen a science book that didn't get updated every year? We can trust that if we want, but we're trusting in the sandiest of foundations. They just don't seem to know it's all guesswork. Or we can trust the fact that this information was handed down so carefully, word for word, over thousands of years, with the elders watching to correct again and again and again. And we can say, 969 years? Wow. That's amazing. And we can look into it and find out why that might have been, and we'll come up with some great answers, by the way. Or we can just say, well, that's what they told me. I have no reason to doubt it. The only reason to doubt the book of Genesis, the only reason to doubt is your own presuppositions that you just flat want to, that you just decide it had to have happened in a different way. That's the only reason to doubt. And I got to tell you, I love you people and all, but you're just not that smart. And neither am I. I'm going to trust the people who were there, and this is how they told me it happened. And I can trust the process. And so, yeah, I believe that what we're about to start to study literally happened. And I believe in the depth of every letter of the writing of it. And we're going to look into just a little bit of it today. Genesis chapter 6. Let me read just a little bit for you. I'm going to read up to verse 8. If we're lucky, we'll get that far tonight. When mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful. And they took any they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, My spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth, both in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of man, who bore children to them. They were the powerful men of old, the famous men. When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he'd made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I've created, off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. Now, this is going to be a good story. You might want to make some cutouts and put them on your nursery wall. This is about to be a great story that we're going to read. And it does help us understand the history of geology of the planet. It also helps us to understand the history of the peoples on the planet, how all that works together. It's really interesting. But it's much more important than that. It's much more important than just history. Just for the history, it's fantastic. But it's so much more important. Because I've got a special piece of news for you. Jesus is coming back. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but I can still believe it 100% because he told me he was gonna. And so far, everything he said he was gonna do, he's done. So why would I believe he's not gonna do that? Well, when he comes back, a lot of things are gonna happen. And I gotta tell you what, I'm excited about that. I mean, imagine if Christmas is coming and you're a little kid and all those presents are building up around the tree and nowhere in the house is there one of those Advent countdown things. How many more days? Oh, you'll find out. When's it going to be Christmas? Oh, you'll find out. You're going to lose your excitement after a while. It's never going to come. And you're just, it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be fun. Well, Jesus wanted to make sure we knew when he was coming back. And so he told us in Matthew chapter 24. Didn't mark the page. Let me grab it here real quick. In Matthew chapter 4, he told us when he was going to come back. Down here in around verse 36, he said, Now concerning that day or hour, ready? He can tell you. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, except the Father alone. God the Father is in charge of that, he said. Now, I'm going to give you a hint, though. Verse 37, about to give you a hint, he said, As it was in the days of Noah, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving into marriage until the day Noah boarded the ark. They didn't know until the flood came and swept them all away. This is the way it will be with the coming of the Son of Man. Oh, okay. So, he says, before the flood, everything was great. People were marrying and giving into marriage and eating and drinking. In other words, they're having a great time. The economy was up. Life was looking good. They were hopeful for the future. They were willing to celebrate the present. Things were going along really nicely. And then all of a sudden, whoosh, they all get washed away. Now, he's telling us that from the perspective of those who get washed away. It wasn't going so nicely. But to them, they were like, yeah, this is just fine. Just fine. Everything's going along just fine, just like it always has. He says that's how it's going to be in the days of Noah. Well, then we better look and see how it was in the days of Noah. So let's just start there. Let's find out how it was in the days of Noah. What was it like in the days of Noah? Once we get a grasp of what it was like, first of all, we're going to discover why God did what he did. And secondly, we're going to see if maybe we should be, looking out the window. Chapter 6, verse 1. Right off the bat's our first clue. When mankind began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. Population explosion. When men begin to multiply on the earth. Any idea how many people might have been on the earth at this time? Do you ever do the math to figure that out? I've seen a couple of different guys do a bunch of math to figure that out. I'll tell you, here's the deal. If a man has 4 kids with one woman, so a man and a woman together, they have 4 kids. If each of those 4 kids marries one time, one mate, and has 4 kids, and each of their 4 kids marries one time, one mate, and has 4 kids, In 10 generations, you'll have gone from one pair that started this, in 10 generations, to 3,070 people. If that continues, each one of those people marries one time, has 4 children. In 20 generations, there will be 3,120,000. In 30 generations, that one pair of people will make 3,220,000 people if each pair has 4 children. Now, these people were living long enough to have a lot more than 4 children. Even if you put in a high infant mortality rate, which has been figured by some of these scientists, even if you put in a high infant mortality rate, there were a lot of people. The estimates that have been given to us range from a count based on Genesis chapters 4 and 5 of 747 million. But that's just based on the names we have in Genesis 4 and 5, to 7 to 8 billion people on this planet. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. And they accumulated quickly. If you put it onto a graph, which I did not do for you tonight because we don't use the screen on Wednesday nights, it just like you expect, it starts out kind of small, it gets faster, it gets faster, it gets faster, and all of a sudden it just booms right up. When mankind began to multiply on the earth. That's the first thing that we know about Noah. Now here's really interesting. Do you know how long it took us to get from Noah and his sons and wives, 8 people, to 1 billion people? You know how long it took the earth to accumulate 1 billion people? It was 1804 was the year that anthropologists tell us we hit 1 billion. So we're talking 5,000 years to hit 1 billion. At the time of Jesus, incidentally, I found this so interesting. At the time of Jesus, there were roughly 250 million people on the earth, on the whole earth. There are 330 million that we know of in the United States. There were 250 million people on the planet when Jesus walked. That's pretty cool to me. Anyway, so it took us about between 5,000 and 6,000 years to hit 1 billion, 1804. We hit 2 billion in 1927, 123 years it took to go from 1 billion to 2 billion. We hit 3 billion in 1960, took 33 years. We hit 4 billion in 1974, took 14 years. We hit 5 billion in 1987, about 13 and a half years. We hit 6 billion in 1999, just under 13 years. We hit 7 billion in 2011, took 12 years. We hit 8 billion in 2022, it took 11 years. Wow. Did you know that our net population gain, so people are dying every minute, people are being born every minute in the world, our net population gain is 250,000 people a day? Whew. Yeah, that's a lot of people. They're telling us at the rate that we're going by 2050 will be well over 11 billion. And there are people really concerned about that. How are we going to feed them all? Gee, I don't know. Let's send a couple billion to Mars is the current plan. Population explosion. When mankind began to multiply off the earth. Okay, as it was in the days of Noah. Well, there's one, check, ding. As it was in the days of Noah. Next, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, this is verse 2, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever because they are corrupt. Their days are 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterwards when the Son of God came to the daughters of men who had children born to them. They were the powerful men of old, the famous men. What in the world are we talking about here? Well, I really don't want to spend a bunch of time on this. Let's take just a minute and talk about who these sons of God were. Daughters of men, that's pretty obvious, right? I got 3 of those myself, daughters of men, because I'm a man and I got 3 daughters. So there you go. Who are the sons of God? There are 3 hypotheses about that. One of them is, and listen, you can just choose whichever one you want, okay? Nobody knows. Good Bible teachers choose any one of the 3. This is not your salvation doesn't depend on this issue. I have my understanding that I'll share with you, but if you disagree with me, it's okay. It's okay. The story works anyway, because the point of the story is not who the Son of Men, or who the sons of God are and who the Nephilim are. That's not the point. Okay, possibility number 1. The sons of God are the holy line of Seth, The sons of men are the unholy line of Cain. They were supposed to stay separate, but the Seth's line saw that Cain's daughters were prettier and went and got them. Okay, possible. Doesn't really hold water. I'll tell you why in a minute. Possible. And if you want to go that way, I'm not going to argue with you. Possibility number 2. Some cultures have referred to despotic rulers as the sons of the gods. So, emperors and stuff like that. They're the sons of the gods. Some of them have. For instance, the Babylonian culture did. Nebuchadnezzar was considered a son of the gods. All right? Okay? So they're saying, well, these guys were building big harems for themselves. They were going around and taking from good people their daughters to build big harems for themselves, basically sexual slavery. Possible? Better than the first one, I think, but still we have a problem because this term sons of God is used other places in the Bible. And every place else that it's used in the Bible, it's B'nai Elohim. Every place else that it's used in the Old Testament, it refers to the heavenly beings, like angels and stuff. And so linguistically, we're stuck with that interpretation, that they are some sort of heavenly beings. Let me give you an example. In Job chapter 1 and 2, God calls all of his angelic beings to account. What have you been up to? Among them is Satan, Lucifer, who's been taking charge of the earth. I've been wandering through my planet, he tells God. Well, all of those that assembled were referred to as B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. So if that's the case, then what he's telling us is that there were non-human beings that were coming and taking human wives. Whew, that's a rough one. And taking human wives doesn't mean that they properly married them and, lived with them forever, happily ever after. It means they were using them for what they wanted. What do we do with that? What do we do with that? Man, we could spend a lot of time on that. I actually got a bunch of notes on that I don't think I'm going to go into tonight. What do we do with that? Well, there's a couple of things we do with that. First of all, we realize that that's not okay. As a matter of fact, none of these things are okay. For a guy to look at a girl and say, she is beautiful and I want her sexually, and so that's what I'm going to do. That's not okay. That's not okay. See, the point of this section is not who are the sons of God, and the point of this section is not who are the Nephilim. The point of this section is that the people had fallen into terrible sexual, abhorrent sexual behavior that should not be happening, that is not acceptable, that's resulting in a generation that's even worse. That's just not okay. It got so bad, their sexual behavior, that they brought the occult into their sexual practices. We actually have history that backs that up. And all those legends you hear about, the Greek gods coming down and taking a human wife and having a half-breed god, man, child, come out of this concept. And in every one of those cases, it wasn't okay. It should not have happened. Generally, she had no choice. And we have a word for that. And that's not okay. The point here that God is making, that Noah told to Shem, the point is that's not okay. God says, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever. In other words, I can't stand this. I don't want to be here for this. Why? Because they are corrupt. That word means they are rotting. Like if you came to Food Bank last week and you got some strawberries and you got home and you put them in your fridge and you forgot about them and they're still there, and right now you're going, oh my goodness, let me tell you what, they are rotting. That's the word. That's the word, corrupt. Like if a fish died in your fish tank 2 weeks ago and you didn't want to dig him out, guess what? It's that word. It's that word. If a mouse got under your kitchen sink and died, and you're smelling something funny and you're afraid of what might be going on down there, that's the word. Corrupt, rotting. They're decaying while they live, God says. This sexual abhorrent behavior is causing them to decay while they live. And get this. The children of these abhorrent sexual activities, the children were the famous men, the men of renown, the ones people looked up to. Oh my. Oh my. Where are we today? Where are we today? The largest industry in the United States is entertainment. Entertainment is the largest, by revenue, the largest industry. It's also our number one export. Entertainment is the United States' number one export by revenue. That in and of itself is bad enough. The entertainment that's growing wildly, there are two kinds of entertainment that are growing wildly. One that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, if we get that far. The other one, well, it pretty much falls under the heading of porn. It's the fastest growing segment. Well, actually, currently, the second fastest growing segment of our entertainment industry. The other one we'll talk about in a couple minutes. It's in the list too. Sociologists have told us that the United States culture, well, the Western European culture, is absolutely saturated with sex. That you just can't get away from it. That every form of entertainment, every TV show, every bit of media that's produced, every song, every banner is saturated with sex. A few years ago, there was an advertisement for the new BMW that was being released that year. It was a big deal. Everybody was waiting for this new BMW to show up. And the advertisement that released the new BMW started with a picture of a very well-endowed young lady wearing a white faux fur coat. And she comes on, side view, black background, white fur coat, and she takes off her coat and pushes out her chest. And it says, BMW, driving excitement, and there's a picture of the grill of the BMW and behind her. Did they sell too many BMWs? They sold a lot of chests. That's the way that our society works now. I really don't have to get into that deeply for you. But the really interesting thing is, so often, the famous people, the people of renown, are the ones who are celebrating these things and pushing these things. Our TV stars and our movie stars and our internet influencers are the ones who are pushing a sexually saturated lifestyle. I'd say that we're right there with Noah. We'll go back next week and talk about what God's talking about when he says their days will be 120 years. We'll go back to that. So, in the days of Noah, there was a population explosion, and the society was saturated with sex. A third thing that happens is in verse 5. The Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all of the time. That's what he saw. Wickedness was widespread, and every inclination of his heart was nothing but evil all the time. Like in Romans chapter 1, their foolish hearts were darkened. They didn't want to retain God in their thinking. But it gets even more than that. I want you to think about that phrase. Every inclination, or if you have your King James, every imagination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. What is evil? Evil is pretty much anything that's developed in contrast to what we know to be the truth of God. And that term wickedness, which we're going to talk about again in a few minutes, is actually the term Hamas. Do you know what that word means? That's a Hebrew word, Hamas. Yes, those fighters over in the Middle East that call themselves Hamas, that's the word. Do you know what that word means in Hebrew? It means a wicked form of violence, is what it means. So they've actually adopted that term for who they are. Interesting. Enough political commentary. Anyway, the Lord saw that that's what was going on. That everything that people could think up was contrary to God and a wicked form of violence. Interesting. I thought, I wonder what the top 10 most popular movies of 2024 were. And one of the things I noticed when I look at the list of the most popular movies of 2024 is that we don't have much of an imagination anymore. We don't, I'm telling you. The number one movie was a sequel. The number two movie wasn't a sequel, but it took characters out of two other movies and put them together to make a new movie. The number three movie was a retelling of an old story. The number four movie was a sequel. The number five movie was a four times sequel. The number six movie was a sequel. The number seven movie was a sequel. The number eight movie was not a sequel. It was a new movie using the same story as an old movie. The number, whatever number we're at moving now, 9 movie, is Godzilla versus King Kong, come on. And the number 10 movie is another sequel. We don't have much of an imagination. So then I started thinking about what were the primary movies that got us to this point. The number one is a movie called Inside Out. And if you like Inside Out, let's you and me sit and have a talk for a minute, because that's about as ungodly of a movie as you can show to little kids without telling them it's ungodly. This is all about a person who's completely ruled by their emotions. And that's okay as long as the primary emotion is joy. As long as they're happy. That's the most important thing in life. Just be happy. Yeah, I'm not even going to dig into Inside Out 2. It's much worse. The next movie is Deadpool and Wolverine, taking two comic book warriors from two different stories and putting them together to go kill other people together now. The next movie is Wicked, and I know some of you liked Wicked. Wicked ticks me off. You know what Wicked does? It's the same thing as, not the next movie, but the movie after that, Despicable Me 4. Oh, that's a cute movie. These are both stories that are specifically told to tell us that villains really aren't that bad. That villains are just fine down deep inside. They're just having a rough time. You gotta be kidding me. Can't the Wicked Witch just be wicked so that the house can drop on her and everybody's happy now? So she can, I'm melting, and go away? Oh, no. We have to now feel bad for the villain because they're actually a good person. The next movie on that list was Moana 2. Sorry if you liked that one too. I'm not into ancestor worship. The next one after that is Beetlejuice, a movie made specifically about a demon who won't go away, and it's a comedy. The next movie after that is Dune 2. I am a sci-fi fan. I watched Dune 1, I watched Dune 2. I did not subject my wife to it because she does not like sci-fi. There's some good stuff in there, but ultimately it's a very violent movie about interstellar war. The only movie here that is kind of good is the movie Twisters, which is basically just a retelling of the movie Twister, and I didn't see it myself, so I can't commentate on it, but I read the plot, and I was like, oh, I saw that movie back in the 90s. Thanks. Was it good? Okay. Godzilla versus Kong, and then Kung Fu Panda, a cute movie about fuzzy animals who kill each other. That's what we've got, people. The imagination we have is not good, and the only thing we can imagine is wicked, is wickedness, is Hamas. What's that? Okay, I got one more. She tells me I'm out of time, but I got one more. Oh, and we didn't even talk about the music. Go back and look up the number one song of every year of the 2000s. Listen, there are words in the titles of those songs I won't even say. The only inclination, the only imagination we can come up with is wicked. And then just one more, and it's in verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, so rotten again, and the earth was filled with Hamas. The earth was filled with a wicked form of violence. Wow. Last year, there were approximately 500,000 people just murdered. Not like in a fight, like to protect somebody. Just, oh, I don't like you anymore. I think now I'll shoot you, stab you, run over you with my car. 500,000 plus individuals. There were 524,000 more that were killed in some kind of war or conflict. On TV, during prime time, on just the major networks, there are 5 violent acts per hour, and 60% of the shows, the primetime shows of any network or streaming service, 60% of them not only contain violence, but actually that's the main part of their storyline, is violence. Get this. Kids' shows have significantly higher rates of violent incidents than adult shows. Significantly higher. The average child who is hitting 18 now has already witnessed, just in media, hundreds of thousands of acts of violence. And now comes to my other toe-stepping, and that's video games. Entertainment is our number one industry. Entertainment is our number one export in the United States. 97% of people between 1 and 18 play video games. 85% of them prefer violent video games. They're not playing Minesweeper. They're playing Call of Duty. 85% of them. Oh, it's just a video game. And it helps with your hand-eye coordination. Yeah, as you're going around randomly shooting people for the heck of it, helps you learn how to pull that trigger. And you know what? It actually does. It actually does. Boys who play violent video games, 51% of the boys age 1 to 18 who admit to playing violent video games have recently, I don't know what recent is, but I'm guessing maybe in the last year, have recently been involved in a physical fight with someone else similar age to them, and 50% of them say that they have purposefully assaulted someone. Now, boys who don't play those violent video games also get in fights and assault people at a rate about a third of the boys who play violent video games. Girls who play violent video games, about half of them have recently been involved in a physical fight, and just under half of them admit to having physically assaulted someone. Girls who don't play violent video games, they also get in fights and assault people, 14% of them. Wow. That's not good. That's not okay. I'd say that our world is corrupt, is rotting. I'd say our world is filled with violence. Oh, it's always been this way. You Christian people, always talking about the end of the world, always talking about the rapture, always talking about the judgment to come. It's always been this way. First of all, no, it hasn't. Why don't you go do a little studying? This is new. In the year 1960, we didn't match the days of Noah. All right? This is new, first of all. Secondly, yeah, we are always talking about the end, and you know what? This guy named Peter wrote about that in 2 Peter. He was actually writing about Noah. He actually used Noah as an example. And he said, back when Noah was on the earth, he told the people, you got 120 years. And they said, oh, Noah, it's always been like this, and it's always going to be like this. You're crazy. And the water came and swept him away. These people who are like, this is the way it is. It's always been this way. It's always going to be this way. No, it hasn't. We are rapidly coming to a conclusion. The earth will not be destroyed by water. It will be destroyed by fire, though. And it's coming, and it's going to be here any minute. Jesus said, when you see these signs, I'm standing at the door, my hand's on the door, and I'm ready to go. That's where we are. That's just our introduction, our happy introduction to Genesis chapter 6. The story gets so much better. Oh, verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of God. The first mention of grace. Oh, I'm so excited to tell you about that. But it's going to be next time, and we'll talk about that some on Sunday as well. So come back. We're going to take our time digging through the story of Noah. After that, we'll take our time digging through the story of Abraham. So we'll be here a while. Let's pray. Lord, how I thank you that we have found grace in your sight, and I pray for any who has not found grace in your sight, that they might